Welcome back. In less than 6 months of office, Prime Minister Trudeau has already experienced an unprecedented amount of international news coverage. Tonight, he makes his debut on the U.S. program 60 Minutes. In a sit-down with host Lara Logan, Trudeau responds to a number of topics: his party's historic win, his refugee resettlement plan, and his decision to pull back Canada's CF-18s in the fight against ISIS. He also takes on criticism about his lack of political experience. Take a look.
Well, I was a snowboard instructor. I was a bouncer in a nightclub. I was a whitewater river guide for many years. I worked as a teacher. I make no apologies for a very varied set of life experiences.
But it's also opened you up to criticism. I mean, we've heard it, you've heard it. You know what people say, that you're too young, you're inexperienced, that you don't have what it takes to do this job.
Well, the way I respond to it is by ignoring it. I mean, you cannot let yourself be defined by the hopes that you will fulfill the darkest wishes of your opponents.
And of course, our Sunday Scrum panelists have their thoughts on the feature interview. Susan Riley, John Ibbotson, and Susan Lund join us again from Ottawa. So Susan Lund, there he was, and he was sort of, it really struck me when he was listing the jobs that he's done. Wow, this guy is Prime Minister, and some would say that those jobs are not necessarily the straight path to being a Prime Minister.
Well, you probably could have used some of those bouncer skills maybe last week in the meeting with the premiers. But here's what I would say. I mean, certainly to Canadians, his story is well known. Most people know that. And as for the criticism of he's just not ready, I think I heard that during the federal election campaign, and that didn't work then. So, it's in a way, on the flip side, it gives him great exposure to Americans. He has an interesting story. His family story, obviously, being the son of another prime minister, adds a little bit. So, it's a chance for, more exposure, more of this international interest in Canada's Prime Minister that we haven't seen for some time. I
mean, I think, John, Susan Lund is right in that most Canadians know the story, but to hear him list, to go through the resume of his job on an American show like that, I don't know, it just kind of struck me. Did it strike you, or is it just Trudeau's just sort of wearing this? And he's not ashamed of any of it. He's just like, this is what I did. And some people may criticize me, so what?
Nor should he be. He'll be judged on his record. Now, look, if a little over a year from now, the Conservative Party will have a leader. Who knows who that leader will be? But if this government is failing, if it has been unable to get a consensus on fighting climate change, or if it is trying to impose some draconian tax, if unemployment is going through the roof because the government's policies are not working to stimulate the economy, or the deficits are beyond all control, and credit rating agencies are warning that Canada is going down a slippery slope. If all these bad things are happening, then opposition leaders, especially the Conservatives, will be able to trot all this out and say, well, he was swanning around the globe giving talks to 60 Minutes and having state dinners with the president. We were all getting shafted. If, on the other hand, he does a good job and he's popular a year from now, this will all be part of that narrative, that he restored Canada's place on the world stage, that even the Americans are jealous that they have the Prime Minister that they would rather have as president. But none of it will really matter one way or another, except as the role that it plays in feeding into a narrative a couple of years from now as we get close to an election.
Susan Riley, CBS's website, they describe Trudeau as a scion of Canadian political royalty. What do you make of all of this interest in Justin Trudeau abroad?
Well, I think it's basically a good branding exercise for Canada. I have no objections. I mean, what's wrong with having an attractive, kind of media-savvy Prime Minister? Nothing. And what, by the way, is wrong with having a former river guide as Prime Minister? Nothing. If anything, I would hope it would teach him it would give him a love of nature, which hasn't been exhibited so far in his approach to climate change. But anyway, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing for Canada. That being said, I think that we always put too much importance on the personal relationships between prime ministers and presidents. It's generally speaking better when they get along, but it doesn't really have a whole lot of impact on policy. And I think we can see that in the softwood lumber deal is raising its ugly head again. And I don't think being friendly and cute and nice is going to help Canada's case necessarily.
Okay, so on Thursdays, the Obamas will host a state dinner for Prime Minister Trudeau and his wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. It's a rare honor to be invited. Obama has hosted only 9 of the opulent dinners. The last Canadian Prime Minister to get an invite was Jean Chrétien. That was during Bill Clinton's term in 1997. But Pierre Trudeau was actually invited to 2 state dinners during his time as Prime Minister, first by Gerald Ford in 1974 and again by Jimmy Carter in 1977. All right, so I thought there was more to that, but there isn't. Susan Lund, let me ask you this, because also in that 60 Minutes quote, and this will just inform our discussion about the state dinner, Trudeau said, quote, "It might be nice," referring to Americans, "it might be nice if they paid a little more attention to the world." Is that crossing the line in terms of what you're sort of supposed to say about foreigners when you're a prime minister?
It's hard to sort of tell without sort of hearing kind of the whole parts around that quote. It is interesting, particularly given that often going into these state dinners, things are often nice and cozy. And certainly the relationship we've seen between him and President Obama so far has been a very warm one, very welcoming. That's part of kind of what's feeding into this dinner. There is often the Canadian complaint, though, that in the world around them, Americans don't often think of issues with Canada, that unless we're a problem, which often we're not, we are not sort of on their radar. Part of what Trudeau's, I think, issue is going to be is not just this state dinner at the White House, is that how does he break through to the state, at the House of the Congress and Senate to try to get some of these issues dealt with, like softwood lumber, that is, as Susan said, once again rearing its ugly head. How is he going to take the sort of glitz and glamour and translate it into resolving some of these issues for Canadians?
So, John, what do you think of that? Do you think that this is more symbolism, or could this be substantive in terms of a renewed, more robust relationship between Canada and the United States?
It's mostly symbolism. I mean, look, we're going to have the state dinner. These are really good-looking men. They've got beautiful wives. They're going to look great in their gowns and their dinner jackets. They're going to say wonderful things. They're going to make nice noises about fighting climate change. But Barack Obama is gone. In less than a year. We will have a new Congress. We will have a new administration. We really need to know whether Hillary Clinton, who I believe is the odds-on favorite to become the next president, will have a Congress that allows her to take real action on climate change, on softwood lumber, on trade, on other issues with Canada and with America's other allies, or whether she won't. This is all suspended animation now until we see what happens in November in the presidential and congressional elections.
So, Susan Riley, Barack Obama, I mean, he's a bit of a lame duck president, right? We know that he's leaving soon, so is there any significance to this?
I completely endorse what John just said.
It happens once a year.
Which is, to stop the presses. But no, I don't. I mean, I think it'll be pleasant, and I think, there'll probably be no gaffes, and it'll be warm, and it'll be utterly meaningless, I think.
And Susan Lund, do we have any insight into why this is the first time in 20 years, since 1997, when Jean Chrétien, that a Canadian Prime Minister has not been invited for a state dinner?
Well, certainly in terms of the relationship between Obama and former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. I mean, Stephen Harper, just as his approach was to the premiers, was to meet with people one-on-one, all business. And I think his dealings with the U.S. president have been business. He wasn't the state dinner kind of guy. And so it does highlight a little bit, I think, of the different relationship. Here's what I would say, though, about the significance of this, just to follow up on the last question, is that, certainly in terms of exposure, right, that sure, he might be a lame duck president, but being hosted by the U.S. president at a state dinner, all eyes look to Washington. They want to know what's happening. So for Trudeau to show up and have this state dinner to get that kind of exposure can only help his place on the world stage, at least for now.
All right. This is great, as always. Thank you all very much. That is the CBC's Susan Lund, John Ibbitson of the Globe and Mail, and freelance columnist Susan Riley in Ottawa. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.